The senator from Alabama.
Yes, Mr. President. First of all, let me thank my colleague and friend, Senator Klobuchar, for those incredible words. As a former prosecutor, we share a lot of the same bonds and knowledge, and we come to this in different ways sometimes than our colleagues. And you express so many sentiments that I'm going to try, and not as eloquent as you expressed today. So thank you for those comments. Mr. President, I come to the floor today both as a new member of this body and a longtime admirer and student of the Senate to offer my perspective on the situation in which this distinguished body finds itself in today. I am deeply disappointed and concerned by the process, the posturing, and the partisanship that has degraded what should be one of the most serious, deliberate, and thoughtful decisions that we as the United States Senate are entrusted to make. Over the course of my almost 40-year career as a trial lawyer, I've represented just about every kind of client you can imagine, from the indigent to the CEO, major corporations and small business owners, individuals charged with serious crimes and those charged with petty offenses. I've also had the incredible honor of serving in the Department of Justice and representing the United States of America. Every one of my clients and every one of those who were on the other side of the litigation in which I was engaged expected and deserved fair, impartial treatment in our courts, and rightly so. But from the moment Justice Kennedy announced his retirement, the conversation about his replacement seems to have rarely been about fairness and impartiality. Instead, it has been about power and politics. This Supreme Court nomination almost immediately turned into a divisive political campaign, with millions of dollars being spent to sway senators on both sides of the aisle, including me. In his partisan-fueled tirade last week, Judge Kavanaugh lashed out at the so-called liberal groups that have spent so much money attacking his nomination. But he never acknowledged, and others in this body have never acknowledged, that conservative groups have also spent a like amount of money, if not more, promoting Judge Kavanaugh. I want to make my position clear today. I think that this kind of political campaign for a seat on the Supreme Court of the United States, a political campaign run by either political party, should be condemned as completely contrary to the independence of the judicial branch of our government. Throughout this nomination process, I have repeatedly expressed my concerns about the way that it has been conducted. It was flawed from the beginning, and it will be incomplete at the end because of a needless rush to a confirmation. From the beginning, I've done my best, the best that I know how in my experience, to exercise my constitutional duty, my duty of advice and consent in a fair and impartial manner, putting aside the political considerations that were being thrown at me from every angle. You know, I have always said in the last few months that it seemed that for those that supported Judge Kavanaugh's nomination, if I had voted to oppose, then I'm going to be seen as nothing but a puppet for my party. On the other hand, for those people that opposed Judge Kavanaugh, if I was to vote in favor of Judge Kavanaugh, I would be seen as bending to a political way to try to get reelected from a conservative state. Neither of which is true. Neither of which is those two. My staff and I have devoted an incredible amount of time, almost every single day, since July 10th, in reading Judge Kavanaugh's opinions, his speeches, his articles, reviewing documents for his time working at the White House, at least those documents that we were able to get hold of, watching his Senate Judiciary Committee hearing testimony and his television appearances, meeting with my constituents and advocates and reading statements, letters, and emails, both in support of and in opposition to Judge Kavanaugh. This was all done in a very serious effort to give thoughtful and fair consideration to Judge Kavanaugh's nomination without regard to party or politics. The one thing I did not get a chance to do was to meet with Judge Kavanaugh. Judge Kavanaugh in the White House called my office a couple of times early on in the process to try to get a meeting with me. And I told him at that time, or my staff told him, that my process was to listen and to read, to understand and do my deep dive into his record and to know all that I can know about him. And as a lawyer, I wanted to watch that hearing. I wanted to see what would occur at the hearing and how he presented himself and the questions that he answered and the questions he avoided, so that when I did meet with him following that hearing, it would be meaningful. It would not be a meet and greet like so many of us have in this body, but a meaningful meeting. So as soon as Chairman Grassley called for the hearing shortly after Labor Day, as soon as that was called in August, my staff started calling the White House to try to get a meeting. We were told that they would still want a meeting, but we continued to be rebuffed. We never got that meeting. We continued to call after the hearing, and then we continued to call at least until the time that Dr. Ford's allegations were made public, and at that point, we knew that a meeting was probably not likely to happen. So for all of those detractors who say that I did not try to get a meeting and I didn't find the time, I did my best to follow the process of deliberation that I felt appropriate for me to do in my process to make that meeting meaningful. And it never happened through no fault of me or my staff. After all of that, we find ourselves in this moment of historical significance, where we as a body have an opportunity to send a loud and clear message to women and men throughout this country. As I have previously said, I believe that Dr. Ford made an incredibly brave decision to come forward publicly and to testify to the full Senate Judiciary Committee. It's hard to do, knowing how she would be vilified. As a former prosecutor, I know how hard it is for victims to talk about these experiences, particularly in cases of sexual assault. I've been moved by the many reports of thousands of women who have felt compelled by recent events to reveal similar stories that they have buried for many years, some for decades. The last few weeks, women have shared with me intensely painful and personal descriptions of assaults. Some who I've known for a period of time but never knew what they were carrying within them. Many of these happened so many years ago, high school, college, as young professionals. Often they hadn't told anyone, even their closest friends and loved ones. Their experiences, while different in detail, have so many similarities. Their feelings of fear and shame and guilt were overwhelming at the time of their encounters. Those emotions exert a powerful hold on these women's lives, even if they go on to find professional success and fulfilling relationships. It is still buried within them, and they don't speak up because they do not want to be known as victims, or they don't want others to have to bear their pain, knowing that nothing can undo what happened to them. In last week's public hearing, I found Dr. Ford to be a compelling, incredible witness. Yes, there were gaps in her testimony, but there always are. There are gaps and lapses of certain memories in situations like these. Those who have worked with victims of assault know that the most traumatic details are seared into their memories, while extraneous facts may fade over time. And reactions of the women when they see their perpetrators are different depending on the circumstances. But they never forget the pain. They never forget the pain of what happened to them. But rather than relive it or face condemnation or retribution, they simply keep it to themselves and go on day after day after day. If you watched our president this past week at his political rallies, you could understand exactly why these women are afraid to speak out. I was absolutely appalled at the president's attacks on Dr. Blasey Ford just days after he called her a credible witness, just days after so many in this body called her a credible and compelling witness. His message was simply this: keep quiet. Nothing happened here. Don't ruin this man's life. And let's continue to stoke the political fires surrounding his nomination. We have heard time and time again that victims must be heard. Time and time again. So often have we heard that in the last 2 weeks, that victims must be heard. But the message from the President of the United States and those that have surrounded him is, yes, let them be heard. Just don't listen. Just don't listen to them. Unfortunately, that message isn't new. The President used his platform to try to intimidate survivors into staying quiet and hiding their pain from the world. But I think he's going to find that while he is focused on stirring up his political base with the misogynistic comments, that women around this country are rising up and they are gaining their strength. They are finding their foothold. They are finding their voices in the effort to expose what for far too long, has been swept under the carpet. Regardless of the vote tomorrow, we cannot and will not ignore where we are in this moment of history. This is a movement that will not be quieted, nor should it be quieted. For Judge Kavanaugh's part, I was very disappointed in his testimony last week. If the incident did not happen, then I understand full well his frustration and his anger. I get it. Any man would be. It is understandable. Both he and Dr. Ford have endured the ugliness of our society. But in my view, he simply went too far by leveling unnecessary and inappropriate partisan attacks and accusations demonstrating a temperament that is unbecoming a sitting judge, much less a Supreme Court nominee. His testimony ran completely counter to the image he attempted to portray in his earlier hearings, in all of his interviews on television, and in the photo opportunities with the various senators. In addition, and this was incredibly important to me, because I had watched it for some time, that in simply refusing to acknowledge the need for further investigation, for a further review of his record, as Senator Klobuchar discussed a few moments ago, by failing to acknowledge the need for further review and investigation into these allegations, he demonstrated anything but the independence necessary for our judiciary. Instead, he has bowed to the White House and to the majority of the Judiciary Committee to plow through this nomination process without a full review of his record and without a full, fair, and complete investigation into the very serious and credible allegations made by Dr. Blasey Ford. You know, I'm certainly not alone in my views, and it's not just people in the Democratic Party or people or senators on my side of the aisle. At last count, I saw where there are some 3,000 law professors, about 40 of which are at Yale Law School, where Judge Kavanaugh graduated. Those law professors has called for his nomination to either be withdrawn or rejected. Religious organizations, including the editors of the Jesuit Review, have done the same. I'm told that just this morning, the American Bar Association, the gold standard of review for judicial nominations, has notified the Judiciary Committee that they are reopening their evaluation of Judge Kavanaugh's character and fitness based on what they witnessed in the testimony last week. That's a significant development that just occurred this morning shortly before our vote to proceed. But even before the recent serious allegations of sexual assault, I've called for a pause so that we could get the documents that we were needed, including those that Chairman Grassley himself had requested. The National Archives reported that due to the volume, even producing those documents on a rolling basis would not take place until sometime this month in October. Well, it's October now. And although we don't have those documents, we have had 2 hearings and now are scheduled to a vote on confirmation tomorrow. Many of those documents could have been produced for review were withheld after being screened by a lawyer representing a number of people under investigation, or at least witnesses in the investigation by Special Counsel Mueller, which raises serious questions as to what documents we got and which ones were being held and why were they being held. Despite the lack of documents, the Judiciary Committee forged ahead and conducted its hearings. Before a vote was taken, Dr. Blasey Ford courageously came forward with her very serious allegations regarding a sexual assault that occurred when she and Judge Kavanaugh were in high school. Again, not for the first time, but again, I and others called for a pause to allow for further investigation, to update the background check that every nominee goes through. Actually, that call was rebuffed for some period of time. But finally, faced with mounting public pressure, the Judiciary Committee agreed to a second hearing, where both the committee and the White House consistently rejected any additional background check, any additional background investigation to be conducted by the FBI. As it turned out, my colleague, Senator Flake, felt compelled to call for such an investigation on the morning of the vote, which delayed the confirmation process for another week. And while I am certainly grateful and glad that the chairman and the majority leader and the president agreed to delay the vote in order to allow an FBI investigation, I believe the investigation was far too limited to have any real use, especially since no further hearings would ever be held. In my career, 40 years almost as a lawyer, I have examined many FBI reports, and I have examined many background checks. And in my review of what was submitted as a result of Senator Flake's request, the FBI was simply not allowed to do what it does best, which is follow the evidence and the leads. In this case, we put the proverbial cart before the horse. The investigation should have taken place before the hearing, so that the senators on the Judiciary Committee could have had the benefit of all the information they needed when questioning witnesses and evaluating credibility, which is where this is coming down. I believe that in cases like this, the witnesses should be compelled by subpoena, not just Dr. Ford, not just Judge Kavanaugh, but other witnesses. Other witnesses who are named should have been compelled by subpoena if necessary to give testimony, whether in the public hearing or by deposition, procedures that have been invoked by this body on many occasions. And this, Mr. President, leads me to another more procedural point. Many of those who want to press forward with this nomination have been invoking the presumption of innocence, and I understand that. The presumption of innocence, however, is afforded to those in this country in our criminal justice system. It is afforded to those who are accused of criminal activity, and it requires the government to rebut that presumption. In other words, that presumption stands between someone accused of a crime and they're going to prison and having their liberty taken away from them. They've now said that presumption of innocence should be applied to judicial nominations. But the presumption applies in a court before we can deprive someone of their liberty, incarcerate them. It is not necessarily applicable when we are simply looking to provide someone with a lifetime appointment to the judiciary. The presumption of innocence from a nominee would in effect turn into a presumption of confirmability that I do not believe is called for in the Constitution. I certainly would agree, however, that given the most recent circumstances, we as a body need to establish some type of standard, some guidelines for our nominees so that this doesn't happen again. And I would say that if we were to have anything close to the high standard of a presumption of innocence, there has to be a full and complete investigation before any hearing in order to determine whether or not the presumption can be overcome. It's the only way to do it. Remember, in this instance, there are no appeals. There's no review. We get no do-overs once we make this vote. We have to take the time and put forth the necessary effort to get it right. Putting forth the time, even if it means the Supreme Court operates with 8 members for a period of time. That's okay. I went to the arguments just the other day, and they got along just fine, listening to the arguments that I heard that day. The American people are understandably disgusted by the way this has been handled. They're disgusted with people on both sides of the aisle. And they were disgusted even before these allegations came to light. They have reason to doubt the integrity of our independent judiciary now more than ever. With a Supreme Court that will be so divided and appears to be so partisan, there will forever be a cloud over this nomination and this nomination process, regardless of the outcome of tomorrow's vote. And many also have reason to doubt the integrity of this body for the way this has been handled. When facing difficult decisions, I often reflect on what I learned from one of my most influential mentors, the late Senator Howell Heflin, a former Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court. Judge Heflin often talked about the Supreme Court as the people's court. Every day, he said, the Supreme Court of the United States deals with real people, their basic human rights and liberties. It has a direct impact on the daily lives of every American, and the people who serve on the court should be held to the highest of standards before being allowed the privilege of making those weighty decisions. I don't believe this process has led us to the person best suited to hold this position. This isn't about politics. No, it far transcends that. I've always said I'm inclined to vote for presidential nominees, but they do not have to have that presumption of confirmability. We have serious doubts about this nominee, which may never be resolved. It certainly was not resolved by the limited investigation that the senators had to go view in bulk. One copy, 10 senators sitting around, passing around. We have serious doubts about this nominee. People across this country have serious doubts about this nominee. To quote the late Senator Robert Byrd, no individual has a particular right to a Supreme Court seat. If we're going to give the benefit of the doubt, let us give it to the court. Let us give it to the country. It was my hope that this body would end up being on the right side of history with this vote and not a political side chosen in the moment. My preference here would have been for the president to send us a new consensus nominee, much like President Reagan did many years ago when he nominated Justice Kennedy. Send us another nominee and give the Senate a second chance to act as a uniter, not a divider. It now appears, however, that we will need to find another way, that we as a body, what has been described in the past as the most deliberative body in the world, that many would question that description today. We must find another way to show the American people that we can uphold the lofty goals that we have subscribed to. Tomorrow, this nomination process will have run its course. But our work for our constituents and all of those sitting in the gallery tonight and all of those watching across this country and who will see and follow this vote tomorrow, our work for our constituents will go on. Our work for this country will go on. Regardless of this vote tomorrow, it will go on. And we as a body have to get to a place where we look forward, not backward. I know, I am confident, I know in my heart, I know we can restore the Senate, that the place it was when I worked here as a young lawyer, a place where compromise meant progress, not a lost battle. Think about that. Compromise meaning progress and not a lost battle or war. We must, Mr. President, set aside the divisiveness, shoulder our responsibilities, and work together. We must do so for the good of this body, for the sake of a country that we all love. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.